Welcome. It is Mass Creative's Virtual Policy and Action Update. It is April 22nd. Here we go. So first up on our docket is the fiscal year 23 budget, our state budget. And G is putting a link in the chat to the page on our website where we are tracking and giving updates to the budget. So fun fact or hot tip, feel free to bookmark that page because we will continually update that in as real time as we can to give you information on what's happening. So where are we in the budget? Back to my lovely complicated timeline. We have finished this section and we are now on the red. I tried to highlight it. So it is April and the House Ways and Means Committee released their budget last week. They recommended $22.5 million for the Mass Cultural Council, which is the largest public investment in arts and culture in our state, right? And the other thing that happened is they released the budget, which is 1.9 more than what Baker suggested in terms of the allocation to the Mass Cultural Council and to arts and culture in the state. And then they said to all of the members of the House, you have until Friday, last Friday, to file your amendments. And over 1,000 amendments were filed by the deadline on Friday. That's not unusual. That's about where we'd expect it to. But included in that was Vice Chair of the Tourism, Arts and Cultural Development Committee, Dylan Fernandez, who's representative of the Cape and Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket. He filed an amendment to increase the allocation to arts and culture to $27.4 million. So why do you do that? Like 22.5 is better than 20.4. Well, this whole process, this whole budget process is about negotiations. It's negotiations between the governor and the legislature. It's negotiations between the House and the Senate. It's negotiations between constituents and their lawmakers, right? And so we definitely are glad to see that the House is recognizing and want to thank leadership, that they recognize the value, but we still think it's important given the last couple of years we've been through and the need for more long-term and annual investments in arts and culture in our sector or in our state to bring it up to 27.4 million. And I think we've talked about this before, but what's so special about 27.4? 27.4 million represents the highest amount that the Mass Cultural Council has ever received for their annual allocation. And that was reached in 1988. So many of us on this call can remember 1988, and it was not yesterday, even though for me, sometimes it feels like it was. So we are trying to reach that high watermark to recognize the role that arts and culture play in connecting our communities, strengthening our economy, and bringing people together. So that's why we're continuing to ask for that. The other piece of this is that we want to make sure that we are working with the House to say we need to see this increase, but we also recognize that the Senate is paying attention at the same time. And if we want to go into being in a strong position when we get to the Senate, we want to make sure that we're doing appropriate and strategic advocacy all the way along. Okay, so what does that mean? Here is our advocacy strategy this year, and it's a little bit different from what we've done in the past for those of you who are veterans and leaders in this work. So just to recap, prior to the House budget being released, or the House Ways and Means budget being released, Michael Bobbitt, Executive Director of the Mass Cultural Council, met with a significant number of House members. And these meetings were basically him sharing what the agency has been doing, why they are asking for 27.4, and what they would do with 27.4. And I think that's important to share. Their goal here is not 27.4 to create new grant programs. It's to increase investments in the grant programs that they already have, right? And that includes support for artists and cultural workers. It's also about support for cultural organizations, right? So it's not about saying like, we're going to create this whole new thing that all of us are now going to have to apply for, but it's saying that in order for us to continue to do the work that our communities depend on, there needs to be an increase in support. So he has had those meetings, and he also is asking those House members to say, you know, we're going to file an amendment and we're hoping you'll be a co-sponsor. So, and many of them said, yeah, that makes sense. Last week, after Representative Fernandez filed his amendment, Mass Creative sent a message to members of the House on behalf of our membership, right? We have members and we have advocates who are part of us. And we said, we're sharing this note as a representative of these groups, of these individuals, to say we really appreciate the 22.4 or 22.5, but we would really strongly encourage that you all co-sponsor that Fernandez's amendment to get it to 27.4. We also sent a separate message to leadership, which includes Speaker Mariano and Chair of Ways and Means Aaron Michaelwitz, to say thank you so much. We really appreciate this, and we are still going to ask for the 27.4. And so between those two efforts, as of this morning, there are 49 co-sponsors for Representative Fernandez's amendment. That's great. That's something that's a sort of like a tried and true of our amendment, is that we always receive a lot of co-sponsors, and what co-sponsors represent is it's an indication that the House, the membership, supports this amendment and supports it by a lot, right? And so it's a good signal and a good message. We're still getting notes from legislators saying, like, got your email, thank you so much, we're going to sign on. And you can check out which representatives have already signed on with the link that we've included in the chat in terms of the budget page on our website. We are going to start sending out on social media quick thank yous and tagging those lawmakers who co-sponsored. That's just a hero opportunity. That's an opportunity for us to say thank you. If one of those reps is your rep, it's a great idea to retweet. If you're running an organization, retweeting that and adding your thanks is helpful. And then the next step that we're going to do is, so the House will begin actual debate on Tuesday. And what that means is like they had the time to file the amendments, they had time to decide which amendments they wanted to co-sponsor, and now they're going to actually do the negotiation and put together the final version of the House bill next week. And so on Tuesday, we want to send a letter to Speaker Mariano and to Chair Michaelwitz saying, again, we know you're beginning to consider which amendments to retain and which ones to let go of. We respectfully thank you for the 22.5, but we want to ask for the 27.4. Now, in terms of how this process goes, this is a moment when it will be extremely useful for us to be able to demonstrate that this isn't just Mass Creative asking for this. This is the whole sector asking for this. And that's why we're putting together a sign-on letter. You as an individual can sign on, and we are also looking for organizations to sign on. We only need one person to endorse per organization, but we do want to hopefully have a diversity and a breadth of depth of practitioners, of geographic locations. Because we want to demonstrate that it's across the Commonwealth, we'll include the zip codes, only the zip codes, so that they can see sort of how diverse the group is that's united in support of this. This is different than what we've done in the past. In the past, we've set up a super easy to use action alert where you can write to all of your to your individual legislators saying, please co-sponsor this. And we've been given some instruction that we've been very successful with that tactic, but it's having a diminishing return in this year and in this instance. And so that's why we chose to go with this strategic approach. It's not because there's less advocacy out there that needs to be done. It's because we're trying to target it into a specific place. And that's why this letter means so much. So we should in the chat now have a link to that. Feel free to take a second now to sign on. Also, it's going to matter that you all who are on this call, who are some of our greatest and strongest advocacy leaders, share this link out with your professional networks. If you are a partner or participate in other organizations or sit on the boards of other organizations, urging them to sign on. Okay, so that is our state budget strategy. We expect, knock wood, that the House budget will be completed by the end of next week, and we'll send an update to let you know what the final result is. This is, again, it's a marathon, not a sprint, a very cliched, but I think appropriate for this week phrase. And so, if we don't get 27.4 in the final House budget, it's not over, right? We have the Senate, and then we're going to go to conference committee. So we're going to continue to work on this together. Okay. So here you go. So the deadline to sign on is April 25th, next Monday at 5 p.m. And we want it at 5 p.m. so we can package it all up and get it to Speaker Mariano and Chair Michaelwitz top of day on Tuesday as the House begins to do debate. Okay. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is kind of a really exciting piece of legislation that a congresswoman from California, from the 13th, is introducing. So this is a federal bill, so it's not on the state level. It really focuses on the NEA and the NEH, but I think it's important to talk about. And this is the Advancing Equity Through Arts and Humanities Act. And this is a pretty exciting piece of legislation because in fact, it's doing a lot of the things and instructing the NEA and the NEH to do the things that are actually included in the Mass Cultural Council's racial equity plan. So nobody's sort of saying this, but I think we all on this call should acknowledge the leadership that our state arts agency is playing on the national stage, right? Like they're setting a tone, which is pretty exciting, okay? So what it would do is it would establish an advancing equity program that would be co-led by the NEA and the NEH. And it's really about looking at how arts and the humanities can combat systemic racism. It would create a grant program that would prioritize actually BIPOC-led organizations and artists and, no, not artists, organizations, and then also organizations that serve BIPOC communities. It would review existing grant programs to think about how those programs are or are not dismantling systemic racism and make adjustments. And that's, I think, everything from what are grant applications looking like and what are the considerations that they take when they're making awards, to like, is this the right grant program still, right? It would also create outreach strategies to make sure that more artists and, excuse me, I keep saying artists, but as we know from the culture wars of the 80s, that's a hard thing for the NEA to fund anymore, but for cultural and arts organizations, to make sure that more of them are applying and recognize that there's federal funds available, specifically targeting communities and organizations that have not had the capacity to do those applications. So that's why they're also going to create TA like free grant writing, right? That is available. And then finally, they're going to create a task force, an advisory task force, which the majority of those task force members need to identify as BIPOC, and they also there needs to be representatives from the arts and humanities. Their time on this advisory task force will be compensated. Again, I think this is a pretty interesting moment here where we're acknowledging that advisory work is work. So this is an exciting piece of legislation. You can see it we've included a link so you can read it. It is going to be introduced, which means it's not even close to being like, debated or put into a committee, but, and also let's recognize that there's probably likelihood that this bill isn't going to make a lot of progress, but it's a pretty important step that we're making here, right? And we will continue to advocate with full faith that it's going to work through the process. So for organizations, there's an opportunity to sign a letter of support in support of this act. So if your organization feels strongly that this is an important bill and an important piece of policy that should be moving on the federal level, we invite you to sign on. Mass Creative has already signed on, so feel free to do so. Now, I'm going to just take a quick pause to look at the chat before I move on to our next subject, just to see if there are any questions about these two items. And I'm not seeing any questions in the chat about the state budget. Oh, John is asking about earmarks for arts and culture. Yes, so you can look through all of the amendments that were filed for the state budget, and there are a significant number that are filed on behalf of arts and cultural organizations. Those amendments were filed both for the line item that goes to the Mass Cultural Council, as well as two other line items that are primarily focused on tourism and local economic development. Those happen every year. We will see that if there's more money in the Mass Cultural Council line item, if more lawmakers try to attach earmarks to those dollars. Our feeling is, and you'll see it in the letter of support that we are inviting you to sign on to. We're encouraging Speaker Mariano and Chair Michaelwitz to retain as much of the 27.4 for an equitable and transparent grant distribution program that we know the Mass Cultural Council can do. So that was the one question I saw. Hazel asks if we can get a copy of the PowerPoint. You absolutely can. We will send that out on Monday along with a recording of this whole webinar. Okay, so I'm going to move us along to the next thing. So this is by special request. I got an email to say, will you please go over the City of Boston's budget proposal that Mayor Wu put out last week? Yes, I will, but with a caveat. Mass Creative is a statewide arts and cultural organization, and this is a reminder to you that if you are not in the City of Boston, your municipality is most likely going through a budget process as well right now. And one of the great things that I think happens in Massachusetts is that local governments are fairly transparent, and you should probably be able to find a copy of whatever they're considering for the fiscal year 23 budget on your city or town's website, or call the city or town clerk and they can help you. And the reason that I think this is so important is that investment in the arts, public investment in the arts, isn't just on a state level, it's also on a local level and a federal level, right? So please check that out and give us a holler if you're having problems accessing that information. Sometimes we can sort of help, or we can match you with a partner who can help. So Mayor Wu put together and made an announcement about her fiscal year 23 budget, but she included one other thing, which is her plan for some ARPA spending. And so I want to go through all three really quickly. So the first one, ARPA spending. Included in her ARPA spending plan is $20 million to strengthen arts and culture in the city of Boston. I want to recognize that this money is from the ARPA dollars. It is not city dollars. And the expectation is that it will be spent over the next 3 years. Here are the two sort of places where they're going to make those investments. The first one is $15 million to elevate and invest in BIPOC-led cultural organizations, and then $5 million for reactivating public spaces, right? So the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture will create grant programs, and will be announcing those grant programs probably shortly, but that's where they're making those key investments around ARPA dollars. And $20 million is nothing to sneeze at, and I think it's a pretty great sign that the mayor of Boston is paying attention to our collective advocacy that we've done through the Create the Vote Boston initiative, and then also cares about this issue. We knew that already, but it's nice to see it kind of come out in the facts and figures. The next piece is the fiscal year 23 budget, and that includes two pieces, right? So there's like, what does it take to run a city annually, just to keep it going? And that's the operating budget. Included in that is about approximately $3.8 million to the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture. This includes their staff. It also includes some of their grant programs. And this is an increase from fiscal year 22, a modest increase, but an increase nonetheless. And then the other piece is the capital budget. And this is for capital projects, building projects, brick and mortar projects, physical projects. And this budget covers between fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 27. And included is $18.25 million for arts and culture projects. And that's a number of memorials and built like statues and public art projects, as well as some work on the Strand Theater, which is a city-owned property. And then it's also where the Percent for Art program, which is an initiative that many of you on this call led the initiative to have that passed and put into place in Boston, where that money goes. And that's money that's 1% from capital project goes in to this fund that then funds public art in the city of Boston. So that is a quick overview. We've included links if you want to get down and dirty. The city of Boston is one of my favorite budgets to look at because they give you the raw numbers and you can play around with them. So have fun with that. And then I just want to remind you all before we sign off. So 2 weeks ago, the Create the Vote MA Coalition had its first meeting, its kickoff meeting, where we did some organizing of people and identified and talked about these goals. We also set up some working groups, right? And so what we're trying to do this year in addition to building a co-leadership and a co-decision-making process for this coalition to make sure that everyone has a say in what we're working on and how we're working. We're also sort of strategizing about levels of engagement, recognizing that not everybody has the time to invest 40 hours a week in Create the Vote coalition work, right? Like, that's our work. That's not necessarily where your time or energies can be placed. And so we've created some levels of engagement that include sort of facilitation of the overall coalition, serving on or leading working groups that are going to focus in on a specific activity or a specific strategy, then being part of the overall coalition and standing in for a monthly meeting to share your opinions and then also help us make decisions. And then finally, the last one is, you want to stay informed, you want to amplify the work that we're doing to your communities, and we have a path for you there. So we really need everyone on board for this to make this work and to make sure that candidates that are running for governor and lieutenant governor are paying attention to the arts and cultural community and considering what our needs are moving forward out of the pandemic and towards the new normal we're all talking about. The best way to do this, if you haven't already, is to fill out our CTV Coalition Interest Form. It'll actually ask you like what level of engagement is right for you and give you a description of all of those. And then for some of you who want to like get really super involved, it'll ask you like, how do you want to get involved? Are you interested in community education efforts? Are you interested in like sitting in on roundtables or planning candidate engagement efforts? So we hope you will be a part of that. I'm going to stop sharing and just check the chat before we sign off. Okay, so Leland asks, is any of the Massachusetts level, state level ARPA money available for arts and culture, arts organizations outside of the Mass Cultural funding? So I think like, are there other ARPA dollars that are going to be used towards arts and culture in the state? So within that first ARPA bill that was passed in December, that money it's 60 million, and that's to for the Mass Cultural Council to distribute. It's important to note that that grant program is going to be for individual creatives, nonprofit and municipal arts and cultural organizations, and for-profit arts businesses. So it's not going to necessarily, it's not going to exclude our for-profit arts business friends, okay? There are other pieces, I would say, that aren't directly, like there's no state equivalent of the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant Program, but there are other ARPA dollars that arts and cultural organizations can and businesses can be eligible for. One that I think about right now is the Hire Now program, which is about helping organizations hire new folks and get them to stay. The other thing that happened, and I still have to unpack it, but yesterday Governor Baker released his economic development bill, which happens at the second year of the end of the session, the legislative session, and he is proposing how to spend a lot more of the ARPA money, I think probably the remaining ARPA money. And so I would expect, if I were a betting woman, that will be the vehicle with which the legislature will also consider how to distribute the remaining ARPA money. And you can count on us that we are going to try to work to advocate for more of that money going to the arts and cultural sector. Okay, so we are over time, but I want to recognize that folks may have questions. Any other questions before we head off? That was a lot of information and a lot of exciting information this morning. Okay, so we've shared our plan with you. We hope you will be a part of it in a couple of different ways. As always, G and I and Jazz are around to help you if you have questions. Karen, who is our campaign manager for Create the Vote, is happy to check in with you if you have other questions about our Create the Vote work. And we will see you soon. Have a wonderful weekend.